All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about one of the most ambitious, most controversial, and, ultimately tragic experiments in all of American history, the Freedmen's Bureau. It was this incredible attempt to answer a question that would really define the future of the entire nation. So let's see how this grand experiment played out.
Okay, let's start with a number. At the end of the Civil War, in 1865, this was the number that changed everything. 4 million. Think about that for a second. 4 million newly freed African Americans stepping out from the absolute horror of slavery into a future that was a complete and total question mark. And that was the massive, terrifying question, wasn't it? What happens next? I mean, how do you even begin to integrate 4 million people into a nation that's not only shattered by war, but is also deeply hostile to them? This wasn't just some political problem. It was a human crisis on a scale that's hard to even wrap your head around. Which really brings us to the core question that America had to face. What does freedom actually mean? What does it mean when you have no land, no money, no education? And the entire society around you was built on the very system that held you in bondage. Yeah, this wasn't some philosophical debate. This was about survival. It was about, where is my next meal coming from? Where am I going to sleep tonight, and do I have any rights at all? The country needed an answer, and it needed one like yesterday. So facing this unbelievable crisis, the U.S. government did something truly unprecedented. It created a federal agency, a whole new part of the government, designed specifically to manage this transition from slavery to freedom. You could really call it an agency of hope.
Now, its official title was, a bit of a mouthful, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, but pretty much everyone just called it the Freedmen's Bureau. It was established in March of 1865, right as the Civil War was finally winding down. And the mission? The mission was just breathtaking in its scope. I mean, look at this list. It was supposed to do everything from providing basic survival stuff like food and clothes to negotiating fair labor contracts, which was a revolutionary idea right there. It was meant to set up schools, help with legal problems, and even take on the absolutely heartbreaking task of trying to reunite families that had been ripped apart by slavery. This was, for real, the first major federal support system for African Americans in the country's history. Now, among all of these huge goals, there was one area where the Bureau's promise really shone through, and its legacy has lasted the longest, and that was education. This is where it would leave its most powerful mark. We're talking about a genuine revolution in Southern education. The Bureau helped get thousands of schools off the ground all across the South. And they taught reading, writing, and math to everyone, from little kids to elderly folks who had been forbidden from learning their entire lives. It also helped lay the groundwork for incredible institutions like Howard University. You see, education was seen as the absolute key to true freedom and citizenship. But it wasn't just about the classroom. The Bureau was also trying to build some economic hope. The whole point was to manage this gigantic shift from an economy based on slave labor to one based on free, paid work. And that meant stepping in to negotiate fair contracts, making sure people actually got paid, and providing a safety net, food and medicine, to stop mass starvation and disease. But, and this is a huge but, for every single step forward the Bureau tried to take, it was hit with this powerful, overwhelming wave of resistance. The reality on the ground was just so much harsher than the promise that was made back in Washington. I mean, even internally, the agency was fighting an uphill battle from day one. It was always underfunded. There were nowhere near enough agents to cover the huge territory of the South. And maybe most importantly, it was never meant to be permanent. It was always seen as a temporary fix. And then you look outside the Bureau, and the challenges were just massive. You had intense hostility from white Southerners and former Confederates who saw the Bureau as Northern aggression. You had President Andrew Johnson himself actively trying to sabotage it, vetoing bills that would have helped. On the ground, you had horrific violence and terror from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And that famous promise of 40 acres and a mule, well, it pretty much fell apart, as most of the land was just given right back to its former Confederate owners. So what you get is this giant, tragic gap between the promise of what could be and the brutal reality of what was actually happening. It really breaks down like this. The promise of education for everyone ran straight into the reality of not enough money or people.
The promise of fair wages was crushed by a system that just wanted to create a new kind of economic dependence through things like sharecropping. The promise of legal protection, it was shattered by just ferocious racism and violence. And that path to real independence, well, it was blocked because the federal government basically lost the will to keep fighting the fight.
Now, it's really easy to look at all of that and just call it a failure. But you know what? That's not the whole story. Because even though it fell so tragically short of its goals, the Freedmen's Bureau still left behind a really profound and lasting legacy. Just think about how long it was around. From 1865 to 1872. That's it. 7 years. A flicker of time, really, to try and undo centuries of oppression. This timeline really puts into perspective just how huge its task was and how quickly it all ended. So what's the big takeaway? The Bureau was historic. It was, for all intents and purposes, the nation's very first federal welfare agency. It was a massive, concrete first step toward civil rights. And it established this crucial idea that the federal government actually has a role to play in protecting its most vulnerable citizens. It was proof that government action could make a difference, even if that action didn't last long enough. And that leaves us with this final, really important question. The story of the Freedmen's Bureau is a story of a fractured promise, right? It shows us both the incredible potential for good when the government steps up and the devastating fallout when it steps back too soon. So we have to ask ourselves, how does the legacy of that broken promise and the forces that broke it still shape the long, multi-generational struggle for equality that continues today?